Hello, everyone. Nice to see you back. Uh, Today is a very special day because we're gonna hear Jonathan's talk. Uh, so, Jonathan, you can start. Do you want to share the screen or?
Yep, I'm gonna share my screen.
Can you do that now?
Yes.
Nice.
So can you all see that? No. Oops.
Yes, please start.
I saw the screen for a second, now it's gone.
Yes, I made a mistake. All right. Yeah, I'll be talking today about the Semitic dorsal fricatives. Okay. And by that, I mean, of course, Chet and Rein, as we can see here on the table of proposed consonants in Proto-Semitic in general. I'll call them dorsal fricatives simply because I don't really want to get into like, are they velar or were they velar, post-velar, uvular? Because everyone has their own opinion on that. And I don't think it really matters too much. I'll talk about them mostly separately. And first of all, I'll always talk about like regular sound correspondences, just, to kind of reiterate that. And then we'll talk about some problems that exist with these consonants in the separate languages. First of all, Chet. I have some languages here. We can see Chet is usually reflected, well, just as Chet. In the older languages, I think you all know these words, so there's not really a point in looking at them all too deeply. The exception is, of course, like Hebrew and generally the Canaanite languages. Aramaic has also this merger Chet with Het. And I think that same thing happens in later Ethiopic. So Tigre, Tigrinya, I think also in some modern South Arabian languages, but I'm not sure. But that's actually quite interesting what's happening in Canaanite because, yeah, it's kind of a longer development and it's not super easy to look through, I find. I'll talk about that for just a second. But at Ugarit, for example, you have two different alphabets. You have the long alphabet, which has some 30 letters, and then you have the short alphabet, which has like 22 letters, I think. And one of the features of this short alphabet is that Het and Rein are merged with Het and Ein. And that's rather early, like we're in the 13th, 12th century BCE there. And then like 100, 200 years later, you can see in Semitic loanwords in Egyptian that there Het and Rein are still retained, so that's probably like a different dialect. Also, I mean, Ugaritic still has Het and Rein, so the short alphabet is probably, what's written with the short alphabet is probably Phoenician or a dialect of it. Yeah. From the 11th century on, we have, of course, Phoenician, in which these consonants were probably merged, at least they are not distinguished in writing. And then, yeah. And the most interesting thing to me was kind of the situation in Biblical Hebrew, because Biblical Hebrew, if you look in, or like the most of the textbooks I looked in were really just like, oh, Biblical Hebrew had Het and Ein, but no Het and Rein. However, the situation appears to be a little more complicated than that because it seems that in the early transcriptions of in the books that were translated into Greek, that is the Septuagint, in the early ones you still have Het and Rein being distinguished, which means that Het and Ein are spelled, have like zero spellings, so they're just spelled like by vowels meeting each other kind of, whereas Het and Rein are spelled with chi and gamma. respectively. And you can see that kind of decline over the later the books were translated. And I think in Ezra and Nehemiah, you have none of these spellings anymore, except for maybe like names that already appeared in other books, and thus like according to tradition. But yeah, I think that's really interesting. Let's look at Akkadian now for a second. Akkadian, in Akkadian, Chet is reflected just as Chet, and there's also Het, which in Akkadian, it exists in Old Akkadian and then it is lost and reflected by 0, with neighboring R becoming E. And that's the traditional view. So usually when you have, if we look at some examples, so if you have like Proto-Semitic Chet, you could say Akkadian Mukhu, school, corresponds to Arabic Mukh, marrow, and Ugaritic Mukh. And similarly, if you have in West Semitic a word with hate, for example, Gez Hams, womb, or Mehri Hams, lower belly, Ugaritic Hams, belly. That word in Akkadian does not have that hate, but instead a neighboring R, if there is one, is turned to E. So Emshu is the respective form in Akkadian. The issue now is that this isn't actually entirely true, because I think like this is the view stated, for example, in the Grundriss der akkadischen Grammatik by von Soden, but already in his Akkadisches Handwörterbuch, in his dictionary, you can see that he proposes a lot of correlations, a lot of connections between words in Akkadian that have Chet in Akkadian, but hate in West Semitic. And these are collected, for example, by Erki Salonen and Josef Tropper, but both fail to really like see an explanation, to see a condition. So if you had like originally Proto-Semitic Chet and hate, maybe you can propose a condition under which Proto-Semitic hate turns to Chet in Akkadian, but they didn't really find anything. And now John Hunegard looked at this and pointed out that there were really quite a few of these examples. So as you can see here, there's like 90, he found some 90 examples for like the usual correspondence Chet to Chet, and some 60 examples for the correspondence West Semitic Chet to Akkadian 0 with E reflex of the R, would like change R to E. And then some 50 examples for Akkadian Chet corresponding to West Semitic Chet, which is a lot. And his solution was to simply assume a third Proto-Semitic consonant that is an emphatic version of Chet, which would have merged Chet in East Semitic, but merged Het in West Semitic. I do not really know if the letter sound change is like how realistic that is. I think it sounds somewhat reasonable to me, but there's not really much to look at for comparison, because the sound in itself, which would probably then have been like an ejective fricative, an ejective dorsal fricative, is fairly rare, and so is the pharyngeal fricative, so it's difficult. But basically, but what is nice about it is that you generally have like these triads in Proto-Semitic, say t, d, and you would add like another triad if you added that consonant. So you'd have ch, maybe, and r. Yeah. So I think that explanation has some merit, unless someone finds a conditioning factor. Yeah. Are there any questions about that so far? All right.
Do you think that when the Greek translations began, they have distinguished between the sounds, but not in the writing, like when Arabic began?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The Greek transcriptions of the Bible?
I have understand that when the Greek correspond, they distinguished between He and Chet.
They
right?
they distinguish between hate and hate in Hebrew then, and
Yeah,
between
exactly.
ein and ein. Yeah.
That should be, or can we understand that they can actually distinguish between them in the
Yeah,
pronunciation, but not in the writing system?
yeah, I understand if Jonathan wants, I can say that so they did distinguish these two sounds probably and have written them with the same grapheme, just like sheen and seen, for example, in Hebrew, which is just one grapheme that is used for two historical phonemes. So that is pretty much what we reconstruct for the stage of Hebrew, like I don't know, 4th century BC or something like that, or third, when the earliest transliterations were made. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, exactly. And the assumption that Joshua Blau, for example, has is that Chet and Rhein existed like at the beginning of the fourth century, 3rd century, like were still alive in Hebrew, and then slowly like were lost in spoken Hebrew, were still retained in the synagogue. So in like when the Torah was read, people still tried to kind of keep those sounds, but because they weren't alive anymore, it became more and more difficult, and so the spellings kind of faded out in Greek transcriptions as well until they were lost entirely, even in like ritual contexts.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, let's talk about Rhein now, which is the more problematic of the two consonants, really. Rhein, well, regular sound correspondences of Rhein. So Rhein is reflected as Rhein in a few languages. Oh, yeah, let's look at the words maybe. So you have, for example, this root here, which means to die. So you have that in Babylonian as abum or tzabum, often with like a p instead of a b. In Ge'ez, you have sabra. In classical Arabic, you have sabara. And biblical Hebrew, you have sabara. Then there's, of course, small, which is, I think, a very common root. Zechrum in Babylonian. Sabaik has it, classical Arabic, Sarir, Ugaritic, and then biblical Hebrew, Sair. And then there's this root to cover. There's aparum in Babylonian, which means like to put on a headdress, I think, or to cover, to be covered, I'm not sure. Afara in Ge'ez, and then there's Rafara, Arabic. And Ugaritic has like also some kind of piece of clothing from that root. And you can see that Sabaik, Arabic, Mehri, and Ugaritic retain Rhein. Biblical Hebrew, we've already talked about that. It merges Rhein with Ein at some point. Probably slightly before the merger Chet to hate. And both Babylonian and Ge'ez are more complicated. They have multiple reflexation. Well, Ge'ez has multiple reflexation. Old Babylonian is just weird. We'll talk about that. Yeah. Just a few words on something I'd call secondary Rhein. Rhein, well, we have among these languages that retain Rhein, it feels to me like traditionally, especially Arabic and Ugaritic were referred to when you wanted to like see, did a word originally have Rhein? I think the modern South Arabian languages are becoming more important there. But sometimes they don't agree with each other. So for example, you have this word Ein in Arabic, Einab, grapes, Akkadian Inbu, fruit, and also possibly Khanabu, which would be weird. Khanabu means like to sprout amply. And I'm not sure if that is connected here, but some people say it is, some people say it isn't. And it would be really interesting if it were. Then there's Sabaik vineyard, but Ugaritic has the same word with Rhein. And on the other hand, you have, for example, this root, which means usually like something to set of the sun, usually, sometimes the moon, I think. Erebu, to enter, to set in Akkadian. Ugaritic Araba, to enter, to die, to set. Sabaik has like that word for the west, which is generally very common to have this like this lexeme, but Arabic has raraba, just that. And I think there are some explanations that some people say that it's actually a different root, but yeah. So generally, this complicates the whole thing, because when you have only one of these languages, that means that you can't say, like, really safely say, oh, this is Rhine, maybe originally. And actually, it was kind of this point, as well as others, that like this idea of secondary Rhine being developed from Ein, that led to this guy here, Rudolf Ruzicka, to propose that Rhine in general was a West Semitic or Northwest Semitic, a Central Semitic innovation from Ein, which at this point is an untenable view that no one holds anymore. But I can kind of understand it, because Rhine makes a lot of issues. And I think it's interesting to note that. Exactly. And also, I haven't really been able to find any research on like conditioning factors for these changes Ein to Rhine, like when they happen or when they seem to happen. So that would be interesting to see. Sometimes you find like the notion that in the root can do that. So that would kind of be an assimilatory process. But as I said, I haven't found any research. Yeah, let's look at Ugaritic. Ugaritic has a very weird sound change. As I said, Ugaritic has like the normal, like Rhine in Ugaritic can go back to Proto-Semitic Rhine, so you Sarir to be small, Ralm, boy. And then Ugaritic also retains the emphatic interdental fricative. So for example, Ugaritic has the word W, a gazelle, and Dillu, shadow, that go back to that sound in Proto-Semitic. However, in some cases, and actually this is all the cases for which it is like proposed kind of without major doubt, there are a few more examples that are somewhat discussed, somewhat debated. This interdental can go to Rhine. So you have Nagara to protect, the corresponding, for example, to Akkadian Natsaru, Arabic Nodara. You have Ramia to be thirsty, and you have Ruru mountain, which seems to be kind of have different form. Like it seems to be difficult to reconstruct what exactly that word was. But this is a weird change, because like if you look at what's happening there phonetically, it might make sense to propose that the interdental fricative in Ugaritic was something like var, so a voiced fricative, then pharyngealized or velarized. I say voiced because it's transcribed in cuneiform by the Z signs, which usually render voiced sounds. And then it goes to like a r or r, which is weird. And there have been a number of explanations proposed for that. So, for example, Otto Rösler tried to explain it away, and he said that, well, it's only 3 words, and so this word for mountain just has a different etymology, Narara, or this word is actually just, it's a different root. It's a root media and firma, and Ramia is a misspelling because it doesn't appear often. Which, yeah, I don't know. Maybe, possibly not. Then Cyrus Gordon assumes another Proto-Semitic consonant, so he does what Hunegar did for the Chet issue, and says there was another Proto-Semitic consonant that merged with Dart in all Semitic languages, except for Ugaritic, where it merged with Rhine. Which seems difficult for one, because what consonant would that be, and also why would Ugaritic be the only one that would like have this different reflex? And then Tropper suggested that this has to do with resonance in the root. So Nagara has nun and reish as resonance, Ramia has mim, Ruru has reish again. And he says it is these resonance that caused, I think, a lateralization that would later go to lead to a backing, which is kind of what's being proposed for Aramaic, where you have a similar sound change of like the lateral emphatic going to Rein, potentially, and then merging Ein. But the issue with that explanation is that it appears that there are quite a lot of other roots with resonance in them which do not do this change. And that's, well, a problem with that. And so we come to John Hunegard's explanation, which he published last year, which is basically a conditioned sound change of this interdental, emphatic interdental to Rein before U. So he says, he vocalizes the words and says, Duru or Duru went to Uru, because there was an U, mountain. And then for Nakara, he says the most, or like two of the most important forms are the prefix conjugation Yaruru and the imperative Nur. And in both of these, the sound is followed by U, supposedly, which would have caused this change, this backing. So U as a back vowel would have backed the consonant the, which possibly also already has a back component through velarization, pharyngalization. So, and the same for this root in which he says the word thirst, rumu, is very common and what does have conditioned the change. Now the important or one of the most important pieces in this assumption is the concept of root integrity that Hunegard proposes, which is basically a specific case of paradigmatic pressure. He says that it is these very common forms like Yahuru and Rumu, in which the change happened because it was conditioned phonologically, and then it was later generalized to less common forms or to other forms in order to keep the root intact. So, because if you have Yahuru, but you also have Nadiru, it is not quite as clear that those are from the same root, and so this would be a paradigmatic thing, which there is evidence for example, Akkadian Balatu, which is supposedly, like Iplut is supposed to be assimilation from Iplut, and then even in forms where the B and L are not next to each other, you have B in order to keep the whole pattern intact. Yeah, that is that point. Does anyone have questions about that? Or the preceding?
I have to.
Yeah.
First one is about Rumu,
Yeah.
or Tsema, for Dama. Why he assumed the sound to be U? It's Tsema in Hebrew, Dama in Arabic.
I think it's Tsumu in Akkadian. And he assumes that the form with A is actually the original form, and that this A was assimilated to the meme and thus like labial rounded to U. So you have like the comparative evidence from Akkadian, but the whole weak, I would say that generally the weakest point of this theory is that it is based on vocalized Ugaritic, on like Ugaritic vowels, which we don't see normally. So yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you. And the second one is about Ghar. I always thought it is related to Ghar in Arabic. It's called cave, the meaning, but It's a special cave in a mountain, like Ghar Hira in the story of Muhammad.
Sorry, which word?
Ghar or
Rar.
Ghuru. I also thought it is a different
Let's
from
see.
Tor or Dhur.
Yes, I'm not sure. I know, like, that I think that is what Rösler proposed. That he proposed, I think, an equation with Arabic Raur, which I'm not sure if that's the same. But I'm not sure about like why it is consistently assumed that Rudu comes from like this Duru. I'm not sure. Maybe Roy has any.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Now let's get to the, I think, most difficult point of the presentation. Rhein in Akkadian, which honestly I feel like I've barely understood anything about this, but we'll see. Rhein is traditionally assumed to have behaved in Akkadian just like Ein, so it was retained probably in Ablate, possibly in Old Akkadian. The evidence is not quite clear. There's like a weird verb form that if you should reconstruct that with Ein would go against that. But if you look in the GAG, for example, you see Rhein supposedly went to Aleph and caused E-coloring, just like Ein, just like Het. And Leonid Kogan showed in 2001, after there had already been some critique on that by Rösler, for example, that view is not really tenable. In Old Assyrian, Rhein probably went to Het, but there aren't a lot of attestations for words with Rhein, to be reconstructed with Rhein. In Babylonian, it is, difficult. We have different spellings in Babylonian, and the issue here is that Babylonian cuneiform has some issues with representing sounds. So this might come into play here. There are spellings of etymological Rhein is zero, kind of. So you have, for example, we already mentioned that it's abu to soak, where you can see the Rhein probably just got lost and the vowels contracted. Then you have Rol, like Proto-Semitic Rol, which is Akkadian Urullu, foreskin, in which the Rhein is just gone. You can also spell Rhein with Het in Akkadian. So, like, Rhein can be reflected as Het. So, as for example, in Tsechru small or Chalapu to cover. Then the thing is that these Het spellings, so you have these signs Cha, Hu, for example, they can also reflect a glottal stop in Old Babylonian. Because you have a hard time rendering a glottal stop in Old Babylonian writing, because there's not a sign for it really. I think there's one that is very rarely used, and then there are like these Het signs, and then you can like do it by just having different vowels next to each other. But one way is, as I said, with Het. And so there are these words that are spelled with Het in Old Babylonian, and then later, once there is a proper way to spell Aleph, and with Aleph, for example, Bu'u, to look for, and Lu'u, throat, which Kogan derives from like root Luh, which would be related to Arabic Luha, Hebrew Loah, Loah. And then there are words in which are sometimes spelled with Het and sometimes without. So you have the word for raven, which is Aribu, Eribu, Cherebu, and you have a word for a ring, I think. I think like what exactly it means isn't quite clear. Hulu, Ulu. And this is really quite confusing. I think there's some point to be made that Rhein could be retained in Old Babylonian, or at least in some dialects of Old Babylonian. For example, those that had close contact with, say, the Amorites and the Amorite language, which could explain some of this, but it's quite difficult. What Kogan did is he looked at, he's first of all split these examples up by when they were attested, so Old Babylonian and later, so after Old Babylonian, and also he looked at where did those spellings appear, in the beginning of the word or in the middle of the word, which leads to some insights that are also kind of confusing. So you can see that at the beginning of the word in Old Babylonian, there's not really, all three spellings appear, but in the middle of the word, chet, like spellings of etymological Rhein as chet are the most common. There's only Tsabu as like the counterexample. Quick note, the issue with this is, of course, that there's no such thing as, like, for example, for verbs, there's not really a thing such as like the word initial spelling, because if you have, say, halapu, as soon as you put that into the prefix conjugation, of course, the chet is in the middle of the word. So it might make sense to exclude verbs or to look at the attestations like form by form, but I think it's difficult. But we can see here that the strong spellings strong spellings I'm saying because like there's actually something written there, appear in the middle of the word. And now if we look at later spellings of Rhein, we can once again observe the same thing. You can see we now have spellings as chet and spellings as aleph. And you can see that in the middle of the word, we have primarily these strong spellings as chet or as aleph. Sadly, there's still spellings as chet in the middle of the word, so not all the chet in Old Babylonian went to aleph, because that would be nice to explain, but it didn't. And so, yeah, this is weird. Another thing that might be interesting here is that, well, at the beginning of a word, Akkadian is generally assumed to have, for every word to have started with a consonant. So either with with a consonant, or if it would have started with a vowel with a glottal stop. Now, that's where, so when you spell in Old Babylonian chet, if you have a chet spelling in the middle of a word, it may well render a glottal stop. But if you have it at the beginning of a word, it can render a glottal stop, but it does that very rarely because there's not really a need, because that's just